A mass of rain clouds gathers above the earth and builds in a particular way. The result is a tropical windstorm that tears through a country. The effect is devastating. The skies above this country have been clear for a long time. The land is bone dry from a drought. The people's crops have failed. A famine results. Look at my daughter, this woman says. She is dying. This disaster has been months in the making, and it will be just as devastating as a tropical windstorm that hits and then disappears in minutes. Disasters may vary in their nature, but they are very similar in their effect. Lives are lost, families are broken, housing destroyed, the social order disrupted, and the environment is damaged. The costs of a disaster can be enormous for individual citizens and for the affected country. There may be a large loss of life. Many others may sustain permanent injuries. Homes are lost. The urban infrastructure and environment are destroyed. Places of employment are gone. Years of development work and money may be lost in a day. These are some of the direct costs of disasters. The indirect costs may be even greater, for jobs may be lost, economic growth delayed, and less investment made in what is now perceived as an unsafe environment. Recovery and rebuilding are expensive. Money spent on disaster relief means money and opportunities lost from development efforts. Money spent on reestablishing essential services, for example, could have been spent on schools. Disasters can cripple a country's development. But the reverse is also true. Proper development can limit or lessen the effects of a disaster. Consider this scene. It is the picture of the aftermath of a disaster. But what happened here before the disaster hit? How was this area developed? What materials was this house made of? Was it strong enough to withstand a tropical windstorm or other disaster? Was it built in a vulnerable area? Why did no one ask these questions before the tropical windstorm hit? The 90s have been declared the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, but it will take more than disaster relief efforts, more than planes filled with supplies to reduce the number of scenes such as these. Disaster management begins in development. Development agencies such as UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and UNDRO, the Office of the United Nations Disaster Relief Coordinator, and others involved in economic and social planning must advocate for and assist countries vulnerable to disasters in planning for these contingencies. Before the blueprints are drawn up or the bricks are bought, it is imperative that countries consider and plan for the possibility of disaster as an essential part of any development plan. Storms from the sky, the shifting and unsettled earth. Disasters are, in a sense, a normal part of our landscape. They have been and will continue to be a constant in our history. What has changed in recent years is how we manage disasters and what we define as a disaster. We are all familiar with sudden natural hazards, such as earthquakes, storms, or volcanic eruptions. High winds or a severe lack of rainfall are natural events or hazards that have occurred throughout history. But when they have an impact on a population, these natural events become disasters. They strike with little or no warning, and they become calamities when they strike a vulnerable population and have an immediate effect. A drought, which may produce a famine, is an example of a slow onset disaster. It occurs when people's abilities to acquire food or other necessities of life is impaired to such a point that their survival is jeopardized. Slow onset disasters are usually brought on by drought, crop failure, pest diseases, or ecological disasters. Contributing factors can include climate changes, demographic pressures, and failures in development. The catastrophic chemical leak in Bhopal, India, is an example of a technological disaster. The category includes industrial accidents and pollution incidents in vulnerable, highly populated areas. Examples of human-made disasters occur when civilians suffer casualties, loss of property, and basic services as a result of civil strife or war. Often these people must leave their homes. They become refugees or displaced persons. Disasters are devastating for a population to endure, and the impact is especially great on the poor. For people in a state of underdevelopment are particularly vulnerable to the next disaster. So when a hazardous event occurs in a vulnerable population, a disaster results, and each subsequent disaster keeps them in that state of underdevelopment. The process of disaster mitigation involves risk reduction, analysis of past and future hazards, preparedness, and the development of appropriate plans for areas that are prone to disaster. In those areas, every development opportunity should be utilized to lessen the impact of any disaster. For example, what crops are planted? If a new crop is planted in an area prone to windstorms, is that crop resistant to windstorms? Countries need to decide which resources are the most valuable and need to be protected in a disaster, be they agricultural or basic services or communication, and which populations are the most vulnerable. Experience has shown that the poor are most vulnerable to disaster. Make them a first concern. The best time to initiate mitigation planning may be in the middle of a full-scale disaster. Prevention looks especially attractive when one is in the middle of a tragedy, especially if that tragedy may have been aggravated by poor development decisions, such as the construction of buildings in an earthquake zone that were not strengthened to withstand the tremors, or the drilling of water wells in marginal areas that contributes to the making of deserts. Or road construction in rainforests that leads to landslides. The planting of this tree, this development is part of disaster mitigation, for reforestation may reduce flooding, siltation, erosion, and drought. These examples are called structural mitigation measures. Non-structural measures include the storing of foodstuffs against the possibility of famine or the education of builders in disaster-resistant construction. Another non-structural mitigation measure Could be legislation to ensure safe and appropriate construction, or including a mitigation component as part of a development project. For example, training agricultural extension workers in disaster-resistant cropping techniques. What follows is a kind of checklist that details steps that can be taken in disaster mitigation. The first is the integration of disaster management in development planning. Is there a policy of including disaster management in development planning? At the national level? At the regional level? How is it integrated across sectors? When new settlements are planned, what's the risk of a disaster? And how would a disaster be handled? Consider the area of hazard assessment. What are the main hazards? Where do they occur? Is there any data available on the size or frequency or even the location of past disaster? Have the hazard areas been mapped? Are they updated as the areas change or more people move in? How will the program officers handle these technical concerns or questions? It's necessary to assess disaster vulnerability. What populations or specific properties or socioeconomic or agricultural resources are particularly vulnerable to disasters? Why? Where are they located? What can be done to make them less vulnerable? The fourth area to consider is how national disaster management is organized. Is there one entity in government that is specifically responsible for disaster management? Is it properly staffed, trained, and funded? How about at the regional level, the sub-regional, and community levels? Are there responsible entities at those levels that are properly staffed, trained, and funded? What about in the area of operational capacities? Does the country have a disaster warning system? Can a warning be given, especially to those populations most at risk? Are the communication systems adequate? Are there backup warning systems? What about a national disaster plan? Is there one? Is it adequate? Is it regularly tested? One last check-off area. What resources are available in each country for disaster management? Is there a training program for those who must manage disasters? Is there a public information program? There are thousands of images that illustrate the after effects of disasters. The goal of UNDRO, UNDP, and other economic and social planners should be to illustrate to countries what can be done beforehand to change this picture. For every development project is an opportunity to prevent disasters, to lessen their effect, and to assist in or teach others about the importance of mitigation as an essential part of disaster management. We have the opportunity, the chance to change pictures such as these.